My name's Tom Bantroff. I think I know most everyone here in the room. I'm the Vice President for Global Engagement here at Georgetown and also serve as Director of our Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs. And I'm really delighted on so many levels to be here with you to celebrate a quarter century of Jose Casanova's path-breaking book, Public Religions in the Modern World. And of course, to celebrate Jose, our dear friend and colleague, whose brilliance as a scholar is really only matched by his warmth as a person, by his ability to bring people together across time, across decades, across time zones. I'll say more about Jose and his scholarship in a minute, but first, a word about the setting of our gathering here. First, those of you gifted in arithmetic will have noted that it's been more than a quarter century since Public Religions was published back in 1994. This event, again, many of you know, was to be held 2 years ago. We played with the idea of holding it last year. That wasn't going to happen. Jose, working with a lot of you, bridged the pandemic with a series of really wonderful online conversations about religion and the secular in a global era over the past year or so. We waited patiently, and here we are. We had the opportunity, we're masked, but the pandemic is easing, and we're delighted to be here in person to celebrate, to challenge one another, to have an extended conversation. And I just want to take a second to thank those who made this gathering possible, who went through all the logistical nightmares I just alluded to, and that continue as the pandemic is still with us. Ruth Gopin and Amy Vandervliet, could you raise your hands? Yeah, thank you. They are just two members of a wider team that is facilitating our gathering here today and tomorrow. Now, the other world event, of course, that frames our gathering and weighs on our hearts is the war in Ukraine. The criminal Russian assault on a sovereign nation that is now almost 2 months old. Our thoughts, our prayers, and our lived solidarity are with the Ukrainian people. And with Jose, a Ukrainian patriot, here with his wife, Ika. With both of you, we look forward to and we will work together for the day when Ukraine will once again live in peace with all its neighbors. And today we are very honored to have, as you'll see on the second panel, Archbishop Boris Gudzyak, who will be participating in this conversation with us. I don't think Your Excellency is here. Oh, he is here. Welcome, just arrived. Wonderful. We're so delighted you can be with us. And again, our solidarity is with you and with Ukrainian people. The struggle of Ukraine is only the latest example of the relevance of Jose's powerful thesis laid out in his 1994 work, Public Religions, which I'll call it for short, and developed, as we all know, in elegant and layered arguments over the years. That religion is not only or even primarily a personal or private matter, that it has a strong public and therefore a political dimension, and that it intersects with wider global secular dynamics in complex and vitally important ways. Now, the basic secularization thesis, so in vogue during the post-war decades, was of course exploded by events, not by Jose, by events in the 1970s and 80s. Think of the Iranian Revolution, the rise of evangelical politics in the United States, the global public diplomacy of John Paul II. But I think you'll agree with me that it was Jose, and it has been Jose, more than any other scholar, who has masterfully analyzed these new trends and their wider empirical and theoretical significance, with an extended argument in his book that he's elaborated on about what he then called the deprivatization of religion and its political significance. And as we look around the world today, I think we can agree that Jose's book, your book, Jose, your work has stood the test of time. How many, I lose track, how many translations have there been? 7 or 8, yeah, not 70, 7 or 8. Really remarkable. And this conference is, of course, more of an extended colloquium, an opportunity together to explore the richness of your scholarly contributions and their significance for our global present and future. If you look at the program, we'll first hear from Hans Joas, who will provide an overview of Jose's contribution to global history and the sociology of religion. Hans's talk will flow into our first panel on religion, secularisms, and public spheres. 3 other panels will follow on other dimensions of Jose's scholarship and his contemporary significance. I'm not going to list all of the Berkeley Center colleagues who will be chairing the panels, all the leading scholars who will be participating. You have them all in your program, and they're sitting here in the room amongst you. But I do want to note a couple of things that may have occurred to you in looking through the agenda. The first is that there's considerable thematic overlap across the panels. Terms such as public religion, secularism, public sphere, and the secular are sprinkled throughout. That's very much intentional. You might think of these as coordinates. These terms are a kind of matrix of Jose's key ideas as interconnected spaces for conversation. And what we envision today and tomorrow, and credit goes to Jose and to my colleague Michael Kessler for putting together the program, is one rich, extended conversation around these and related topics. You won't be hearing formal papers or watching PowerPoints. We'll all be participating in a shared dialogue. Which leads me to the second peculiar thing about the program, that Jose himself is only featured once at the end. Don't worry. We don't want Jose to keep to himself over the next couple of days, and we don't expect him to. About half the time for each panel will consist of discussion with the audience, and Jose is right here in the front row. We can't wait to engage you, Jose, in discussion about your ideas and their wider significance, and I know you're looking forward to it too. If you'll allow me just one personal note before I introduce Hans. When we were setting up the Berkeley Center back in 2004-2005, Jose, you won't be surprised to hear, was at the very top of our list of scholars we hope to recruit. Through good timing and good fortune, we were able to lure him away from the New School for Social Research, where he had studied and taught for well over 2 decades. A native of Spain, educated by the Jesuits as a young man, Jose was intrigued at this particular point in his life about what he might accomplish at Georgetown, the Catholic and Jesuit university, not leaving the New School or his networks behind, but indeed bringing them with him, as we see here today. Jose, we're so grateful that you joined our community and for all of your contributions in the intervening years. You've supported the Berkeley Center, our faculty, our staff at every step of the way, serving our mission and redoubling our impact through your incisive scholarship and your amazing connectivity. That's a word that occurred to me. The engagement of your friends and colleagues around the world, a powerful network represented at this conference, who'll be sharing the floor with you today and tomorrow. So it's really tremendous to be here together with you, Jose, with you, Ika. Thank you all for coming. All right, now let's get the conversation started. It's my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Hans Joas, who's already well known to most everyone here. One of the world's leading scholars of issues at the intersection of religion, philosophy, and society. Hans has served since 2014 as Ernst Turch Professor for the Sociology of Religion at the Humboldt University of Berlin. Before that, from 2011 to 2014, he was a permanent fellow at the Freiburg Institute for Advanced Studies, and from 2002 to 2011, served as director of the Max Weber Center for Advanced Cultural and Social Studies at the University of Erfurt. Hans has also served and still serves as visiting professor of sociology and social thought, and as a member of the Committee on Social Thought at the University of Chicago. He is the author of a powerful series of influential monographs, too long to mention here. For the sake of brevity, I just want to limit myself to 3. First, his brilliant book on pragmatism, The Creativity of Action, published in English in 1996. The second example, The Sacredness of the Person, A New Genealogy of Human Rights, published in 2012, which grew out of Berkeley Center lectures here on campus. And most recently, a really persuasive and impressive work, The Power of the Sacred, an Alternative to the Narrative of Disenchantment, which was published by Oxford just this last year. Hans is the recipient of many awards. I'll just mention a few: the Werner Heisenberg Medal from the Humboldt Foundation, the Max Planck Research Award, the Paul Ricoeur Prize, and a Distinguished Lifetime Achievement Award from the German Sociological Association. Hans, thank you for traveling here from so far to be with us on this wonderful occasion. We look forward to your reflections. So please join me in welcoming Hans Joas.
Good afternoon. Let me first of all express my gratitude for this invitation. It's a great honor for me to have a chance to speak about the life work of my friend José Casanova, whom I have admired since I first read his book on public religions in the middle of the 1990s, and then admired even more when we first met at the New School for Social Research when I was there as the so-called Theodor Heuss professor. I will try to give an overview of José's intellectual development and his contribution to the field between global history and the sociology of religion. It was in 1969 that a highly gifted boy from provincial Spain, more precisely a village in Aragon, having completed his studies at a church-run high school in Zaragoza, set off for Austria to train as a Catholic priest. We have to imagine what Spain was like in the 1950s and even in the 1960s, governed by Francoist fascists, backed and legitimized by the Catholic Church, generally isolated on the international stage, economically backward, and cut off culturally from the rest of Europe. Still, José, this young gifted boy, describes the village of his early years when he had no thoughts of a brilliant future career in the international sociology of religion, even as a distant dream, as a pre-industrial life world in which he spent a happy childhood. His path led him away from this familiar environment to studies in Innsbruck. This is much better, thank you. A city, Innsbruck, he experienced as kind of representative of the modern world. There he acquired the broad foundations of philosophical and theological knowledge that we can discern again and again in his work. His most important academic teacher turned out to be the theologian Franz Schupp, successor to the great Catholic theologian Karl Rahner, in the chair of dogmatics at Innsbruck. The spirit of the Second Vatican Council could be felt there far more than in Spain. So much so, in fact, that in 1974, when the mood in Rome had shifted again, the church stripped Schupp of his teaching license. The church's aggiornamento with regard to democracy and religious freedom, the broad switch from a natural law to a personalist frame of reference, a declericalized conception of the church, these are the motives that José Casanova absorbed at the time. They show up again and again in his writings. For example, when he calls in 1992 the famous pastoral letters issued by the US National Conference of Catholic Bishops on nuclear arms and economic justice, I quote, "the closest empirical approximation to the institutionalization of discourse ethics at the general level of civil society," end quote. because these texts were not simply placed before the believers as a fait accompli, but emerged from a complex process of consultation of the bishops with experts, interest groups, activists, Catholic dissidents, and of course, the Vatican. Course content in Innsbruck covered a broad spectrum, including the great classical and modern theologians of Catholicism, their Protestant counterparts, liberation theology, and critical theory, as you might have sensed when you heard about discourse ethics in connection with pastoral letters. In Innsbruck, Casanova also met the woman of his life, Ika, sitting next to him, born as the daughter of Ukrainian displaced persons in Bavaria, who was to exercise a major influence on his intellectual and political development. In 1973, José gained his master's degree in theology. It was also at this time that he decided not to become a priest or a theologian, but to devote himself to sociology. This is why he occasionally calls himself a late ordained sociologist. With all due respect to the colleagues in Innsbruck, it is fair to say that their university was not the ideal place to advance within the discipline of sociology. It was Franz Schupp, the academic teacher I had mentioned, who gave the up-and-coming young scholar the somewhat paradoxical and for Germans depressing advice that anyone wishing to build on the great German tradition of sociology, geared towards universal or global history and undergirded by philosophy, should not go to Germany to study, but to the United States. From this point of view, German sociology at the time was Americanized in a negative sense and in such a superficial way that it had largely repressed its own impressive tradition, while the German heritage was more often preserved and furthered on the other side of the Atlantic. This advice referred specifically to the New School for Social Research in New York, whose graduate faculty had absorbed so many outstanding émigrés from Germany and Austria during the Third Reich, and had perpetuated these traditions after the Second World War, later taking in Eastern European émigrés as well. This institution became José Casanova's academic home for decades. It was there that he completed his MA in sociology in 1977 and his PhD in 1982. His most influential academic teacher at the New School was Benjamin Nelson, though he died in 1977. Almost forgotten today, he had become known chiefly for his major study on the history of usury, that is, the prohibition on charging interest on loans in the book of Deuteronomy. This study falls within the genre of the broadly conceived sociology of economic and moral behavior anchored in the history of religion, a field that had produced such outstanding works since Max Weber and Ernst Rölsch, and probably embodies the ideal that José Casanova strives to emulate. From Casanova's earliest publications onwards, Max Weber has been a key reference point in his work. While he has shown great interest in the competing interpretations of Weber's work, he has articulated his own views without the fanaticism that has often induced Weberians, particularly in Germany, to indulge in personal animosity and sectarian schisms. This refers to the fact that I have the impression that in the literature on Max Weber, there are many people who think of themselves as being the reincarnation of Max Weber. And for them to encounter another reincarnation of Max Weber is, of course, a major challenge that leads to these irrational controversies, and José has kept away from that. So the picture of the young José Casanova that emerges from his first publications is of a sociologist with a clear set of questions in mind and an unambiguous methodological orientation. He was mostly interested at the time in why Spain's history was so different from that of the West, although it's a bit ironic to say from the West, because Spain is located in the extreme geographic west of Europe. Why it took so long for Spain to become modern in this Western sense. His methodological orientation was that of Weberian comparative historical research, supplemented by an emphatic understanding of democracy and the public sphere, something you don't find in Weber. But José found in the writings of the young Jürgen Habermas, and distinguished by his critical distance from the so-called modernization theory that dominated the Western social sciences in the 1950s and 1960s. In an early essay, José Casanova brought out how exponents of the theory attempted to draw lessons for development policy from a profoundly Protestant narrative of the rise of Northwestern Europe. Lessons in which the post-war United States appeared as the ultimate in social development, with a sort of civilizational hubris that had been typical of the Victorian Britain of the 19th century as well. The subject of José's dissertation, consonant with his intellectual foci and methodological orientation, was Opus Dei. More precisely, that's the title, The Ethics of Opus Dei and the Modernization of Spain. In studying Opus Dei, he had no interest in conspiracy theories or in posing as a criminologist seeking to uncover the history of a holy mafia, as Opus Dei is often being called. His goal was to examine how, I quote, a reactionary, clerical, traditionalist, and anti-modern fundamentalist regime could have contributed to the modernization of Spain. Who exactly were the agents of this modernization? What was the source of their ideas? Why were they relatively successful within the regime? To what extent did Spanish modernization nonetheless remain partial? One can clearly sense in these questions the school of modernization theory with its core concern, namely what could be the functional equivalent of the Protestant ethic, supposedly decisive in Northwestern Europe in the case of other successful processes of economic modernization. Robert Bellah had exemplified this in his analysis of the, at the time, only successful Asian case, namely Tokugawa, Japan. However, in contrast to the views typically held by modernization theorists, José Casanova, drawing on Habermas's critique of technocracy, took a critical view of administrative elites. With regard to the success of the organization he was investigating, he argued that Opus Dei succeeded in prompting the Franco regime to embrace administrative rationalization and, in some cases, the rule of law, the goal being to integrate the Spanish economy into the world economy without destroying the regime itself. Religion, of course, played an important role in this analysis, but it would be grossly foreshortened to label Casanova's research program at this point in its development simply as sociology of religion. It was far more broadly conceived, and if I am correct, it stayed that way. Casanova does not see religion as a small specialist field which he investigates, such as others study the sociology of sport or the sociology of nutrition. without an understanding of the centrality of religion. For him, like for the classical figures of sociology, Max Weber and Emil Durkheim, there is absolutely no prospect of gaining an understanding of processes of societal change. Here, however, we are faced with the apparently paradoxical fact that sociology regards as its classical figures two scholars for whom religion was crucial and who dealt with social phenomena across the entire history of humankind. As a discipline, it has for a long time increasingly been shrinking to the status of the study of the contemporary world, while even marginalizing also the study of religion. This paradox, I think, can only be resolved if we recognized that the two classical figures themselves contributed to this unfortunate later development because their writings entailed assumptions about religion's progressive loss of importance in a novel historical formation that is, in modernity, whatever that is, a disenchanted or secularized modernity. At precisely this point, the train of thought begins that led to Casanova's most important work to date, the book we are celebrating here. From the second half of the 1980s, inspired by dramatic historical developments, such as the Shiite-inspired Iranian Revolution of 1979, the Catholic-influenced Solidarność movement in Poland, the rise of Protestant fundamentalist Christian right in the United States, and the productive role of the post-conciliar Catholic Church in democratization processes in many countries, especially in Latin America, including the Sandinista revolution in Nicaragua, Casanova turned, inspired by these historical changes, to the question of the exact nature, consequences, and legitimacy of such politico-religious mobilizations. The resulting book, published in 1994, is, as we all agree, a groundbreaking achievement. It's no exaggeration to call it a classic in the sociology of religion and in sociology in general, one that symbolizes a veritable paradigm shift in research in the field. The book, Public Religions in the Modern World, whose merits I probably don't have to summarize. I will very briefly do that in 4 key points. First, more effectively than anyone else, José brought clarity to the tangled morass of secularization concepts, thus furnishing many successors with a suitable vocabulary. All too often, those involved in these debates talk past one another because one debater takes secularization to mean, for example, the decreasing importance of religion in general, another, the withdrawal from the public sphere, and the third, the liberation of spheres of society from religious control. These differences could be neglected only if developmental tendencies in these different respects all pointed in the same direction. But this is far from being the case, as is immediately apparent to anyone in the United States, for example, where a fairly strict and historically early segregation of state and church or religious communities has not only gone hand in hand with the enduring vitality of religion, but has likely played a major causal role in bringing this about. Second, where Casanova truly departs from a tremendously widespread assumption at the time is this topic of an ongoing privatization of religion. When reference is made to a retreat of religion into the private sphere, it is far from clear where this private sphere exactly lies? Outside the state, in civil society, outside state and civil society, in families, or outside state, civil society, and families only in the inner spiritual life of individuals? Another ambiguity, it seems to me, can be discerned when the investigation of public political religious mobilization is condensed into the thesis of the advancing deprivatization of religion. I'm not totally happy with that thesis either. It may be unclear whether the privatization thesis should be considered empirically refuted once and for all, or whether it should be described as historically outdated due to new trends away from privatization. So was it wrong all the way, or has it become wrong? There is certainly a need for further clarification here. This need has become even more pressing due to the complicated shifting of the boundary between the private and the public. For example, in connection with the abuse scandals that have so damaged the reputation and the inner life of the Catholic Church. Due to José's interest in feminist criticisms of an overly simple quasi-spatial separation between public and private spheres, he was also sensitized at an early stage to the conceptual and factual problems at issue here. Third, his main interest in the book was in the dynamics of political religious mobilization at the level of entire societies. Hence, we can read the chapter on Spain in his great book as a continuation of his previous sociological analysis of Opus Dei, but now with less focus on economic modernization and more focus on democratization. As Max Weber already saw and articulated in his writings on Russia, advances in capitalism and the progress of democracy are not related as straightforwardly as modernization theorists would like to believe. And although the modernization theorists claim Weber is one of their predecessors, so to speak, there is clearly a major difference here between Weber and modernization theory. I see Casanova's book as, in this sense, a Weberian analysis of democratization processes in Spain, Brazil, and Poland, with special emphasis on the role of believers and religious communities, while also paying plenty of attention to other actors and to the learning processes of all those involved in such developments. The political goals and doctrines of churches and religious communities, in particular, are not so fixed as they tend to present them in retrospect. In the Catholic Church, however hierarchical and centralized it may appear, there have always been complicated influences flowing also from the bottom up. In a similar vein, Casanova then dedicated 2 chapters in his book, namely those concerned with the United States, specifically on Catholicism's path to the status of respected denomination, and on Protestant fundamentalism to the role of churches. This time, however, his focus was on the part they play not in democratization processes, but in an established democracy. Here, however self-assured their claims to moral truth may be, they must conduct themselves as mere participants in public debates. They cannot rely on the state to help them exercise power imperiously, bypassing both the convictions of religious believers and those who expose secular worldviews. And fourth, this brings the normative aspect of Casanova's work into play. Public religions is exemplary not only because of the originality of the questions posed, its conceptual clarity, and historical empirical approach, but also, at least as I see it, because it does not shirk the responsibility of coming to normative conclusions on the basis of empirical research. The book makes a clear case for the legitimacy of a public role for religion and thus rejects a fundamentalist secular humanism whose proponents often describe it as liberal, that seeks to monopolize the public sphere and, in the idiom of economics, to compel the churches to withdraw into their core business of pastoral care. Of course, Casanova also rejects pre-democratic claims made by the churches and their voluntary limitation to those who already agree with them. Casanova's empirical findings, conceptual suggestions, and normative statements are not entirely uncontroversial. As it happens, the book's reception was sluggish in the beginning. Despite a number of efforts, for example, from my side, for many years, no German publisher was prepared to commit to a translation. There's never been a German translation of the book. In retrospect, this seems like an interesting indication of how little interest there was, at least in Germany, in the study of political religious mobilization as recently as the mid-1990s. This changed radically after the attacks of 9/11. Due to its scholarly quality, Casanova's book now gained wide recognition all over the world. By then, of course, he had developed his ideas considerably and in several different directions. Again, 3 such directions are particularly worth highlighting. First, public religions was occasionally assailed for its limitation to Catholic and Protestant Christianity. In fact, his close connections with Ukraine have familiarized José Casanova with Orthodox Christianity as well, and in several articles, and with increasing frequency for obvious reasons, he has also written about the religious situation in Ukraine and religious pluralism in post-communist societies in general. The real challenge to his theories, however, was posed by the major non-Christian religions, especially Islam. Most significant in this connection are his ingenious comparisons of the history of Catholicism and Islam and their perception in Protestant or secular public spheres. We should not forget that in many countries, Catholicism was long viewed as nationally unreliable. I mean, in the US also, but also in Germany, incompatible with democracy and impeding the integration of immigrants, much as Islam is often claimed to be today. The successful history of Catholicism in the United States as the classic country of immigration prompts Casanova to draw optimistic conclusions about the future of Islam, albeit with a great sense of proportion and sensitivity to the long path that may lie ahead. If we make more analytical space for non-Christian religions, including some of those originating in Asia, the challenges mount with regard to issues of historical depth. For example, the question of whether the concept of the secular, whose roots lie within a Christian framework, can be appropriately applied to other world religions, requires us to go back to the wellsprings of these traditions. As a result, under the influence of Shmuel Eisenstadt and Robert Bellah, Karl Jasper's concept of the axial age has become increasingly important to José Casanova. One key concern for him is to clearly separate the 3 contrastive, I find that very helpful, the 3 contrastive conceptual pairs, sacred versus profane, transcendent versus immanent, and religious versus secular. Because only through this discriminating lens can we truly grasp the specifics of religion in so-called tribal societies and archaic states, the great upheaval involved in the emergence of world religions, and the sacralization of secular content in the 19th and 20th centuries. Second, the aspect of the conventional view of secularization that Casanova initially considered worth preserving increasingly faded in his later works. I'm referring to the differentiation of state and religion as a necessary component of modern societies. International comparison has made it increasingly clear that neither the French nor the US-American model can simply be seen as a template for others or as an indicator of modernity as such. Before his untimely death, the German legal theorist Winfried Brugger produced a very impressive model, a typology that elaborates the variety of arrangements lying between theocracy and secularist dictatorship. Overall, in any case, the notion of functional differentiation has clearly receded as a guiding thread in José Casanova's writings. Third, in light of his empirical studies of the part played by religion in the integration of immigrants, Casanova has underlined the diversity of conditions in different countries and the correspondingly variable role of specific religions. Again, I will mention just 3 of the many findings of this research. Traditionally, immigrants to the United States tend to become more religious as a result of migration. But this does not apply to all countries of immigration. While religion is often regarded as a medium of integration in the United States, it tends to be seen as an obstacle in Europe. In the past, the impact of religious pluralism in the United States was limited to the religion of immigrants in the country itself, but today, thanks to the ease of travel and communication, this effect often extends to the countries of origin as well. In general, Casanova has increasingly sought to provide a comprehensive panorama of globalization from a religious standpoint. The Catholic Church in particular, which has always considered itself a global player, though it was long Eurocentric, and in its upper echelons, one could even say Italocentric, has completely new opportunities to make a transnational impact. Opportunities, of course, that it may fail to take advantage of. All religions today are becoming available for individual or collective appropriation outside their cultures of origin. At the same time, they are coming under pressure to take a fresh look at the particularisms they have brought along with them from the cultures in which they were previously embedded. Religion, culture, and territory are becoming ever less aligned. I found very impressive the fact that in the First Vatican Council, Catholics in the colonies were represented by the bishops that came from the colonial powers. In the Second Vatican Council, one of the main causes, I think, for the dynamism of the Second Vatican Council was that the European and North American bishops actually met bishops from non-European, non-North American cultural contexts. And this process has widened in the recent years. And for the first time, a pope who is not a European by origin, so to speak. Yeah? At present, José Casanova is not just an analyst of globalization, but also in the transnational Catholic public sphere and scientific community, one of the most important voices providing informed commentary on one of the most far-reaching historical developments of our time, namely the globalization of Christianity. But his global presence and orientation do not prompt him, as postmodern authors have often done, to apparatically link skepticism about the Enlightenment with Enlightenment-inspired skepticism about religious traditions. In a brief, brilliant critique of Zygmunt Baumann's outline of a postmodern ethics, he wrote the confessional line, "Without embeddedness in some particular moral tradition, the morality of the autonomous self has no content and must perforce be vacuous." Now, I skip a longer passage on the one criticism that José has taken most seriously, so to speak, the one by Talal Assad, and on what the exchange with Talal Assad meant for the future development of José. Because I definitely want to say a few things on his work in the last 20 years or so that I put under the headline globalization of Christianity. The catchword in this new phase of his work is no longer modernization, you could say, as in the earliest phase, or secularization, as in the second phase, but now globalization. Unfortunately, this term is as ambiguous as the other two. Obviously, the expansion of global relations of production and trade, the deregulation of international financial markets, the availability of rapid means of transport, the technological enabling of global real-time communication, and migration flows across long distances are not simply aspects of one and the same process, although there are a number of causalities between them. Casanova has yet to bring the same kind of clarity to this term as he did for secularization. His research on religion and globalization has developed in two main directions, one more contemporary, one more historical. The contemporary phenomenon that interests him most was mentioned briefly when I referred to the loosening of the links between religion, culture, and territory in the context of globalization. The decisive term coined by José Casanova for this is global denominationalism. Casanova asserts that the system of denominationalism, claimed by H. Richard Niebuhr to be specific to the United States, and also identified by David Martin, mutatis mutandis, as a feature of Britain and post-colonial societies, especially the former British and Spanish colonial empires, is a key aspect of the present-day global religious situation. This idea is evidently stimulated by the contemporary Pentecostal movement. I quote José, "A highly decentralized religion with no historical links to tradition and no territorial roots or identity, and which therefore can make itself at home anywhere in the globe where the Spirit moves." This observation is not meant to detract from the fact that under the conditions of globalization, new opportunities, as I already said, are also opening up to the Catholic Church, a religious institution that has always been globally oriented, and in sharp contrast to Pentecostalism, features a profound connection with tradition, a pronounced hierarchical structure, and a clearly identifiable geographical sacred center in Rome. What matters to Casanova is not whether centralism or decentralization increases the chances of religious expansion. The point he's making is that for the first time in world history, the fundamental universalism of world religions can become and is becoming a social reality. In religions, which from the axial age onwards developed this idea of universalism, the idea of a single humanity and a common history, a shared history, this idea was always hedged in by their de facto ties to a specific civilization. But mass migration and electronic mass media are altering this linkage. Hence, for Casanova, the famous and infamous diagnosis of a clash of civilizations is backward-looking and misleading precisely because it fails to factor in the deterritorialization of cultures. This present-day proliferation of deterritorialized, transnational, global imagined communities applies to the old universalist world religions, but not only to them. The new situation also fosters the emergence and spread, and here I quote José again, of hybrid globalized religions like the Baha'i, the Munis, Hare Krishna, Afro-American religions, Falun Gong, and so on. In these circumstances, it is plainly apparent that the universalism of all previous religious and secular systems of orientation for humankind has always been a universalism of highly particular institutions and traditions. Now, however, insights into the coexistence of a plurality of universalisms, that in my eyes is the ingenious idea of Karl Jaspers, so to speak, to say, I'm a universalist, but we live in a world of coexisting, competing, cooperating universalisms, and they could unite against a world of particularisms, opens up the potential for increased cross-tradition learning processes, intercivilizational encounters, cultural imitations, diasporic diffusions. These are all terms I take from José: hybridity, creolization, transcultural hyphenizations. Of course, these are not the only tendencies we might identify. My goal is not to trivialize conflict and the erecting of boundaries, new homogenization and fundamentalism, but to pay due attention to these growing universalist tendencies as well. As in the denominationalism of US American history, these tendencies could provide an opportunity for greater mutual recognition. In something of a summary of his decades of research, namely in his so-called Cadbury lectures, Casanova has now outlined the historical prerequisites for the transnational denominationalism of the present. More than other globalization theorists, he focuses not only on changes in the global distribution of religious practices and beliefs, but on changes in or the establishment of new institutional structures. In this respect, Casanova's work stands squarely in the tradition leading from Max Weber via the British sociologist David Martin to a political sociology of religion across the globe. David Martin's long-standing intellectual restriction to Europe and North America, which he only partially overcame in his late work by examining the global expansion of Christianity, is finally overcome by José Casanova through the inclusion of Islamic countries, China and Japan, and their respective religio-political constellations. As yet, however, some aspects of this gigantic project have remained quite sketchy, and Casanova has certainly not consistently expanded his perspective to encompass Chinese and Indian history to the same degree as Robert Bellah did. He has so far mostly added historical depth to our understanding of Christianity in Europe and in the former colonies. These special features of his argument seem to me to be particularly worth emphasizing, and we can give them a clearer profile by contrasting them with other influential analyses. First, with regard to religion. For Casanova, the modern age does not begin, as it does for many scholars, with the Reformation or with pre-Reformation tendencies towards the strengthening of individualized piety, nor, as in the work of Charles Taylor, does it start in the somewhat arbitrarily chosen year of 1500. Instead, it begins in 1492 with the first vigorous attempt to religiously homogenize a European state, namely Spain, a process that entailed the expulsion of Jews and Muslims. Casanova's decision here stems from the assumption that we can understand the history of religion only in light of its interaction with the history of the state, rather than purely with respect to its endogenous tendencies. Second, In no uncertain terms, Casanova also contradicts the widespread liberal historical narrative according to which modern religious freedom and religious tolerance are a direct result of the bloody European confessional conflicts of the 16th and 17th centuries. He calls this narrative, I quote, the basic story of the modern separation of religion and politics, and counters it with the thesis that the so-called religious wars of the early modern era are more aptly described as wars of European state formation. It was not, Casanova tells us, secularization that resulted from these struggles, but the confessionalization of the state and the territorialization of religions and peoples. And I think this is very, very much supported by the scholarship on this era, by the scholarship of the last few decades on this era. Third, José makes a sharp distinction between two types of religio-cultural pluralization today, namely pluralism based on different forms of religion and pluralism characterized by the distinction between religion and secularism. Here the late work of sociologist of religion Peter Berger is clearly present in the background. Long one of the best-known exponents of the secularization thesis, and especially of the notion of the progressive privatization of religion, in old age, Peter Berger dramatically abandoned these long-held views and embraced the idea of the progressive pluralization of religion. Casanova builds on that, but divides the two forms of pluralism, religious and religious secular, between different regions of the world. On this view, Europe, to put it formulaically, is characterized by secularization without religious pluralization. The rest of the world by religious pluralization without pronounced secularization. Unlike Berger, Casanova does not assume one single process of modernization leading to pluralization, but rather multiple processes with different resulting forms of pluralism. Again, one could say this is only the first step. After all, voluntary or forced forms of secularization are not entirely absent outside Europe, and there is some religious pluralization in Europe. We can identify cases of religious pluralism in pre-modern societies, and pluralization is not exclusively a result of modernization. Migratory movements in past and present have always been a complicating factor, and it would be necessary to distinguish within pluralism the mere coexistence of alternatives from an appeal exercised by these alternatives. If you understand what I mean, I'm referring to William James's notion of genuine options. I mean, there can be Muslims in your society, but you never think of converting to Islam because of the mere existence of an Islamic minority, so to speak. So Islam can be a live option for you or cannot be a live option for people. And that's mere coexistence versus pluralism in the sense of an intense exchange. Now, last step, as historically rich as José's work on global denominationalism and its emergence and consequences is, it is centered on sociological systematization rather than historical research. It is thus worth noting that in recent years, José has devoted also a good deal of energy to a narrower historical subject, though one that is particularly well suited to shedding new light on the history of globalization. I'm referring to the Jesuits as a key component of this history. José, together with Tom Banchoff, portrays the Jesuits as the pioneers of a globalization avant la lettre. From their founding until the 18th century, no group has contributed as much to the creation of a global cultural network and a global awareness. Casanova describes the order as the first conscious global network because the cultural knowledge gained on site and the dictionaries and grammars it produced could circulate worldwide in Jesuit educational institutions scattered around the globe. Here, globalization comes vividly to life as something that does not simply occur as a result of modernization. In a nuanced account, Casanova evaluates the Jesuits' receptiveness to the various cultures in which they maintained outposts. This is not the place to go into detail about this research, which has so far been published only in fragments. What matters is that it is an attempt to show how the great historical phases of the Jesuit order and those of globalization mirror each other, and to gain new perspectives from each that help us understand the other. What were the preconditions for the Jesuits' pioneering role? What triggered the papal prohibition on the order in 1773? What led to its reinstatement in 1814? What was the order's position in the history of Europe's imperial expansion in the 19th century? What exactly was its position vis-à-vis the nation-state in Europe? To what extent did the order lay the ground for the Catholic Church self-reform through the Second Vatican Council? What alternatives to globalization as it currently exists does the Jesuit order offer at a time when a Jesuit is pope for the first time in history? And finally, is there a route to the globalization of brotherhood? Last sentences. While the Axial Age religions produced the beginnings of an ethos of humanity for the first time in history, and while the processes of globalization have made the idea of one humanity a social fact today from an economic and technological perspective, many questions remain about the global history of moral universalism. With the help of José Casanova's research on the global history of religion in the present era, as well as the studies produced by Robert Bellah and others on the history of religion, starting with the Axial Age, we can begin to answer them and finally to overcome, as I would like to say, the limitations of both the Weberian and the Hegelian narratives of religious history. Thank you.
So we have time for one or two questions.
The current research interest that I have is on Newtonian. Thank you. So the current research interest that I have is application of Newtonian laws to understanding group dynamics. Because I've studied Jewish group dynamics in the Second Temple period, and the results are published in my monograph.
Excuse me, do you have a question?
Yeah, so my question is, to what extent do you feel that the imbalance in pluralism that you implicated or insinuated to, that may fail to exist with particularisms that exist, to what extent is that result of Newtonian law at play, where things in motion will remain in motion until they stopped, or things that are stopped will remain stopped until pushed into motion, meaning these particularisms can act on each other to create a kind of new antithesis, resulting in a synthesis that may not have been computed into the social, economic, political environment in which these religions were found.
It may be a consequence of my being extremely jet-lagged. that my presentation was a little bit hesitating and that I have difficulties understanding your question. But so let me try to reformulate it. I understand you as saying an important topic is the interaction of these particular religious communities, even if they are universalist in their own orientation. And I fully agree with that, because I think against, so to speak, certain forms of secular philosophical universalism, that nobody who is a universalist loses all his or her particularities. We remain highly particular beings, and universalist religions remain highly particular, not particularist, highly particular communities. So the challenge is not to treat others as non-universalist, but to accept the fact, as I said with regard to Karl Jaspers, that we live in a world of coexisting, competing, cooperating universalisms. And this is a particularly hot topic, of course, with regard to the relationship between Christianity and Judaism, because there is an almost 2,000-year Christian tradition of labeling Jews as not universalist, or not as universalist as they themselves claim to be. Now, maybe that's enough for the moment. I'm not able to connect that with the Newtonian.
Just hone in on one specific thing, and it's actually an invitation to you, but also an invitation to Jose. As someone who knew and worked with Peter Berger for 31 years, and who was a friend with Jose Casanova during, I believe, all of those same years, I very much appreciated the kind of historical sociology that you did of Jose Casanova's situation, location, within the sociology of religion and within the sociology of modernity. My question is, however, is as much directed towards Jose. Jose, is the characterization of Peter Berger and your differentiation of, you're aligning yourself with the multiple modernities approach, which I think is correct characterization of you. Is that quite accurate with regard to Peter Berger? I see these two gentlemen, that is Peter Berger and Jose, as in a much more sustained dialogue, and actually much more convergent on just this point. Peter wasn't as articulate. He wasn't sort of doing the empirical research, but I know from his interactions with Jose that actually he shared this conviction with regard to multiple modernity, Shmuel Eichenstadt and Jose, and he actually looked to and appreciated Jose for precisely the way in which he nuanced both a universalistic sociology with one that acknowledged multiple modernity. So I'm raising a specific question with regards to that very small sociological sub-theme within this really superb presentation. Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So maybe I answer first, and then Jose should, and I shouldn't speak about the closer relationship between Peter Berger and Jose, who knows this much better. So I would just like to make 2 points. I think for the history of sociological theory in the last few decades, Shmuel Eichenstadt is the crucial figure in leading to this, if you might want to call it, paradigm of multiple modernity or whatever. And Peter Berger's contribution to that either does not exist or is not highly visible. I don't know. But I would like to add, and that's my second remark, that I'm personally not totally happy with this notion of multiple modernities. And there were only allusions to that in my manuscript. You know, when I spoke in several passages about the need for a global history of moral universalism, this is not the same as speaking about multiple modernities. And the reason, to put it in one sentence, is the reason I have greater difficulties with the notion of modernity, so to speak, than Shmuel Eisenstadt seemed to have. But this opens a whole world of debate, of course. And now, Jose, and maybe, yes. Should I
Well,
say?
Peter Berger, actually, I came to the New School to study with Peter Berger, but he was gone then. But we met later, and we were very close. He came back to the New School when I became the chair, and we shared a lot of things, yes. The main difference is Peter Berger remained a modernization theorist, a theorist of basically Western modernity. And he claims that it is modernity itself that produces both pluralisms, secular religious and multiple religious pluralism. I precisely started with 1942 to say no. The European road that begins in 1942 is one of homogeneous confessionalization of religion that eliminates religious pluralism, ethno-religious cleansing, is generalized throughout Europe with the exception of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and the process of religious pluralization is linked through Western colonialism, what I call globalization. So it's not modernity itself that can be the explanation for both pluralisms. Either globalization is the explanation for pluralization of religion, for this process of universalization or multiple universalism. I'm also not that happy with the multiple modernities theory. Multiple axialities, yes. Multiple axialities, yes. And this for me what is crucial when universalism emerges in Western, in global history, global humanity, it emerges at least in 4 radically different forms. So from the very beginning, you have 4 radically different universalisms: the Israeli, the Greek, the Chinese, the Indian, or the Hindu, right? And we could add more. So this is the fundamental dimension for me, the multiplicity of universalisms. Whether this is related to modernity itself, I'm not so focused anymore on a modernity theory that explains everything. That's why I try to go to a process of globalization that begins before Western modernity. That's why I'm going back to the 16th century, because otherwise global history begins basically at the end of the 18th century with America and the French Revolution, the Industrial Revolution, and all the rest can be forgotten because ultimately it's going to be overcome by modernization. My point is we should begin with globalization before, and therefore is less Eurocentric, the whole perspective. Peter Berger remained a very Eurocentric, despite his American conception, a very, in this point, Eurocentric.
Thank you, Jose. Thank you, Hans, once more for your brilliant overview of Jose's work. You've got us off to a great start. I will note we do not have an official coffee break now. We'll be starting right up here. Just a couple of minutes. The conversation will continue. And please join me in thanking Hans one more time.